What if I told you that for many Americans, despite success or education or promise, they can still be denied their right to rent a house? This is due to something called the Thurmond Amendment, and it has plagued America for quite some time. But there is increasingly a movement to overturn the Thurmond Amendment. So what is this amendment? And how does it work? Why does it bar so many Americans from renting properties? Yusuf Dahl, who's the Chief Executive Director of the Century Promise, has been working on this issue for some time, and he joins us today to break down those questions and more. That's all coming up right here, right now. I'm Sam Chen, and this is Face the Issues. Good evening and welcome to Face the Issues. I'm Sam Chen. It surprises many Americans, but there are those who are otherwise very successful, and when it comes time to renting a house, they're denied. And they're denied because of a specific past sentence or charges that were brought. This is under something called the Thurmond Amendment. Over the years, there's been talk about repealing it. Members have tried. These efforts have not succeeded. So what is the Thurmond Amendment? Why is it in place and what does it do? And more importantly, why hasn't it been appealed and will it ever be appealed? Yusuf Dahl serves as Chief Executive Director of the Century Promise, but outside of his work there, he has worked on this issue for some time. He joins us tonight. Yusuf, welcome back to Face the Issues. Thank you again so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Last time we sat down, we talked about your work with the Century Promise, and we talked a little bit about your journey. And you also do a lot of work on the Thurmond Amendment, separate from your work at the Century Promise, but it also ties into your story and your journey. Let's just start with the 30,000 foot level. I think a lot of our viewers, if they're older, they might know the name Thurmond. If they're younger, they might have no idea who we're talking about. But what is the Thurmond Amendment?
So the Thurmond Amendment is a piece of legislation that was introduced by a former South Carolina Senator, Strom Thurmond. Strom Thurmond is a noted segregationist who voted against the original Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, and Fair Housing Act. Mm-hmm. And with this amendment, Strom Thurmond essentially excluded fair housing protections for anyone who had a drug distribution conviction. And so what that means is whether looking to buy or rent a house, a person with a drug distribution can be denied, mm-hmm. regardless of how much time has passed since their conviction or the severity of that conviction.
So this is not something, this is a very specific charge. So this is not even a drug possession charge. This is a drug distribution charge. And the Fair Housing Act made it largely illegal to discriminate on a variety of different grounds for housing, for renting or buying. And this became this one exception that was carved out. Walk us through why drug distribution. This is kind of how our politics works. And I think this is unknown to the majority of people when they watch how some of these laws get put forth.
Well, that's a great point. And when we, just taking a step back, when we talk about drug distribution, if you were caught with an ounce of marijuana, is that possession or is that distribution? The reality is it depends on the discretion of the district attorney. And by the way, that ounce of marijuana 10 years ago, which was drug distribution, now it's completely legal. Mm-hmm. And so it's oftentimes people hear drug distribution and they immediately think, Pablo Escobar or the importation of fentanyl or anything like that. But like anything, there is a spectrum. But this legislation does not make that distinction. Mm-hmm. If that is the charge that you have, you fall underneath the Thurmond Amendment and you lose fair housing protections.
And the interesting thing, I think, is that you can look at this and you put this to the general public, and a lot of people at first glance go, yeah, I'm not sure I want to live next to somebody who distributes drugs or who sells drugs. I don't want to live next to a drug dealer. And at first glance, you go, this is fairly reasonable. We don't want people living next to drug dealers. But then you peel back the layers a little bit and you realize that much of this is very, very much in line with Thurmond's segregationist past. And the idea, to your point, a lot of this was at the determination of a district attorney, and especially in the South in this era, generally these distribution charges can get slapped on to racial minorities, to especially Black and Latino individuals, where it may not always happen in a different region. It may not be the same charge, even though it's the same crime with somebody who is white. And so you have this underlying sense of there is a racist undertone to this without it being overtly racist. And I don't think that's always understood by the public when we talk about the Thurmond Amendment.
Well, there's a lot you said to unpack. First of all, drug dealing is an act that somebody commits. Mm-hmm. It's not an immutable characteristic that never goes away. When I was 18 years old, I sold drugs. I am 43 years old. I am not a drug dealer.
Right.
And so it's really important. And if we strip everything else away, what this really comes down to is, as a society, do we forever want someone to be permanently judged by the worst thing they have ever done? And the answer is a resounding no.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's intriguing also, I think, that we have rules, we have laws that say, for example, if somebody who is convicted on sex crimes moves into your neighborhood, right, everybody's notified, but they're not denied housing. There's no rule that says somebody who is convicted of a sex crime can be denied housing, but yet somebody who's convicted of a single distribution charge can be. I think there's a lot of things we can kind of compare this to and hold this up to and say that doesn't seem to make sense now that we zoom out and see the grand scheme of things.
Well, and it's a well-known, it's an incontrovertible fact that our criminal justice system has not been applied equally.
Correct.
It's just an incontrovertible fact. And so HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, Department of Housing and Urban Development, in 2016 issued guidance. And what they said is, you cannot as a landlord put a blanket ban on criminal convictions. So if you and I own an apartment building, we cannot say we're never going to rent to someone who's had justice involvement, because Black and brown people, minorities, have been disproportionately impacted by that system, by the criminal justice system. So if you have this policy, even though it's facially neutral, right, we're not discriminating based on any protected characteristic, by dint of the fact that people of color are disproportionately impacted, you are going to discriminate based on race, even though it's not your intention. Correct. Except where it comes to drug distribution convictions, because Strom Thurmond decided in the late 80s that this, and in fact, I have the video footage of him on the Senate floor introducing this legislation.
One conviction is sufficient. My amendment simply says that one conviction is sufficient for a landlord to refuse to rent to a drug dealer. It's that simple. I urge my colleagues to vote for this amendment. Failure to do so makes the rights of law-abiding citizens meaningless. Drug dealers deserve no federal protection.
And it's clear he hadn't even thought the whole thing through. He just gets up there and he mumbles along and he says, people shouldn't have to rent to drug dealers. And the bill passes unanimously, but it was a feature of the time that we were in. And that is not the time we live in today, and that's why I'm working to repeal it.
You talked about the guidance that HUD offered.
Yeah.
Why didn't HUD also push on the Thurmond Amendment? Is it because they couldn't, because it's part of this bill, or is it because it's kind of like out of sight, out of mind?
It's what you said, it's the law. HUD cannot introduce guidance that contradicts law. And so to remove this barrier, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it, which affects millions of people in this country, it's going to take an act of Congress.
And to your point, this is back to the idea of federalism and the idea that each of our branches of government has a role and a responsibility, and they cannot do the other branch's job for them.
Exactly.
So no matter how much HUD or an administration wants to undo the Thurmond Amendment, if it's passed by Congress, it can only be undone by Congress.
Exactly.
You mentioned earlier that this affects a lot of people. It's affected you. Could you tell a little bit about your story? You shared with us last time as well about your journey. How did this amendment come into play in your life?
Yeah, so it's important to note that the Thurmond Amendment not only impacts individuals, but family. And for me, the reason I've taken this issue on, because this transcends housing. To me, this is all about opportunity because zip code matters. Yeah. And so specifically, I was recruited to lead the Century Promise, as we talked about, an organization that provides opportunity for young people. At the time, my daughter was a rising high schooler. And my daughter, I'm very tall, you can't tell I'm sitting down, but my daughter, is six feet tall. And as a rising high schooler, a lot of her identity was built into her athleticism. She's a great tennis player. She made it to states her freshman year.
Congratulations.
Yeah, she's that's a sport she's invested in and she's very committed to. So, but also her academics. So as you can imagine, as we were looking at housing options, the quality of the school district was paramount in our decisions. So we identified a couple of districts that had great academics, but also a great tennis program. I was unable to secure housing in any of those neighborhoods because of a 25-year-old drug distribution conviction. Yeah. So I want to be clear so the audience understands this. I've had zero interaction with the criminal justice system in 25 years. I've since then graduated from Princeton. I've built a successful business. I have an outstanding credit score. I have a great income. None of that mattered. And at the end of the day, we were eventually able to secure housing in a school district that the Commonwealth has designated as failing. Yeah. And the school was so impoverished that it did not have a tennis program. Wow. And when I saw the impact of this, and it's really an arbitrary law because as you talked about, it only applies to someone who has been convicted of drug dealing. Doesn't apply to someone who's been convicted of armed robbery or assault or any other charge. So it really is very arbitrary. And when I saw the impact that this legislation had on my daughter and the opportunities that she would have, that's when I made the decision that it would have to end and I would make sure that another young lady or a young man did not have their opportunities limited because of this legislation.
Yeah. Yusuf, thank you for that insight and for putting that so articulately. We're going to go to the break. When we come back, I want to talk about the effort to repeal this now, where it's stalled, and potentially what hope we have in the future for seeing this repealed. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Face the Issues is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV. Positively different. Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand, or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device, or go to our website lighthousetv.org for more information. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Yusuf, let's pick up where we left off, and I want us to move this conversation toward how to repeal this thing. But just for a moment here, continue on this idea of the impact. You mentioned it's not just you who's impacted in your case, it's your daughter, right? It's families that are impacted. One of the things as we're talking the break that you have brought up is depending on what part of America you live in as well. First of all, this is an amendment that covers all the entire country. So depending on what part of the country you live in, there could be even an added disadvantage. Where we are here, where our studios are in Lehigh Valley, you had mentioned to me is one of the hardest places to get into an apartment for rent. But it's also true about buying. I mean, we have been in a seller's market for quite some time. Yeah. How does that increase the impact?
Yeah, it's really a perfect storm that's brought this amendment to the forefront. Because really across the country, but if we just focus in on where we're at, there are 20 applicants for every vacant apartment in our community. The market is that strong. Wow. And so if you're a landlord and you have 5 good applicants, well, it's kind of logical to say, okay, how do I start to filter these people down? Now, you might think the logical thing is to, and I would agree with you, that, well, who's the first person who applied, who met the criteria, let's go with them. But a lot of landlords still believe, and it's hard to fault them because our federal government has sanctioned it, they believe that if you have any criminal involvement in your past, that is one way to whittle down that list. And so if you're somebody who has put their past behind them and is trying to make the most of their second chance, particularly given the housing market we are in, you are at a permanent disadvantage.
Wow. Yeah, because the landlords don't need, per se, that they've got this full quiver of people to choose from. They don't really need if they lose 1 or 2 people. And to your point, we've been in this kind of seller's market or renter's market, if you will, for so long that it does leave you at such a permanent disadvantage.
And it's a perceived issue on the part of landlords because there's empirical evidence that shows if you have had 0 involvement with the criminal justice system for 7 years after you were released, the probability of you recommitting a crime is the same as someone who never went to prison. So this perception that someone with a 20-year-old marijuana conviction is somehow a risk to the tenants, and that is more important than their credit score, their income, their rental history, it's just a perception, it's not reality.
You mentioned that this has brought the Thurmond back into the spotlight. Where do we stand right now on an attempt to repeal it?
So one of the most interesting pieces of this amendment is how few people actually know about it. So I recently had a meeting with the Wisconsin Realtors Association, and I'm pleased to announce that they have endorsed the repeal of the Thurmond Amendment. But as I presented to their legislative council, 0 realtors were aware of the Thurmond Amendment. And this is an amendment that directly impacts their business because, again, right now, anyone in this country can say, I am not going to sell Yusuf Dahl my house, or I am not going to rent Yusuf Dahl my apartment, which has happened to me, because he was convicted of selling drugs 25 years ago. And so the main focus right now is continuing to educate people about the impact of this amendment. Now, we are working with Congress to try to generate bipartisan support to repeal this legislation to extend opportunity to people in our country who need it the most.
Oh. Have there been attempts in the past to repeal it? And to your point, this is something that Congress needs to repeal. This is a federal law, and so states don't really have the ability to just throw caution to the wind and say they're not going to listen to the federal government. Have there been attempts in the past to repeal this?
Now, I just want to make one point, particularly for the benefit of viewers who really know about fair housing. So the way fair housing laws work is the federal government kind of passed the floor. The Fair Housing Act, as we know it, is the floor in terms of the protected classes and characteristics. So think race, think gender, et cetera. States do have the ability to pass additional protections. They can't vote away what the federal government enacted, but they can add to it. New Jersey is the only state in the country that has passed legislation that has neutralized the Thurmond Amendment. So it is possible, but again, that's one of 50 states. And I can tell you there's a reason it's one of 50 states, because it's very difficult to pass any type of statewide housing reform legislation. So I just wanted to make that distinction. But to date, there has not been an effort to repeal the Thurmond Amendment. And I think that's a function of who is impacted by this legislation. I mean, at the end of the day, this legislation really does impact the most vulnerable people in this country. Most people are not in my situation where they have the resources, the bandwidth, and the capital, right, social and otherwise, to take this legislation on. Most people, when they're denied an apartment, have to deal with the immediate need of housing and have to move on with their life. And I just want to note one thing in terms of how unfair this legislation is the apartment complex that we applied for, they knew they did not accept any renters with a criminal record or a drug distribution conviction, yet they still happily took my $125 application fee and ran my credit. And what I don't understand is why not be upfront about that policy and save the time and energy of people, but that's not happening. Not happening.
Wow. There's an interesting, you wrote this piece for the Washington Post about it, and in there you wrote, having served as the president of Wisconsin's largest apartment owners trade association, I was not really surprised that my rental application was denied. And you went into how you had to tell your daughter about this. Yeah. You served as president of Wisconsin's largest apartment owners trade association. That fact doesn't change anyone's mind that this, to deny you, that it is just that one conviction 25 years ago that is the only thing that people look at.
Well, it didn't change the mind of this apartment complex, certainly, but I do think that experience has allowed me to connect with industry in a way that historically advocates have not been able to. So as I mentioned, I'm very proud that not only the Wisconsin Realtors, but the Wisconsin Apartment Association has endorsed this repeal. And for me, repealing the Thurmond Amendment is a common sense reform that industry has to get behind. And as I talk to industry, I say this is really an opportunity for industry to lead on something. Because yes, I'm advocating for the repeal of this legislation, but this is something I started 18 months ago. I've been a landlord for over 20 years. And I can tell you, as a landlord, this legislation does not make sense. This legislation does not improve the safety and well-being of communities, and this legislation only perpetuates the disadvantage that unfortunately plagues a particular segment of our population.
What do you think it takes to get this through Congress? We talked earlier about Congress right now in this Congress with the slim majorities in the House and the Senate. They struggle to get anything done. Is this going to take a bipartisan coalition? Is this going to take bringing together people from all the different factions in the party? What do you think it takes to get this done?
Well, it's going to take people, right? It's going to take your listeners learning about this amendment and hopefully coming to the conclusion that this is not right. And as we generate support, we will get legislators to act. I will say, I've spoken to people across the aisle, right? People you would think very conservative, people you think very liberal. I have not had one person tell me this is bad policy. I have had people tell me this is a bad political moment.
Okay.
But that's not acceptable to me.
Yeah.
The fact that we have millions of people in our society that do not have access to housing, do not have access to certain communities, but we're not going to do anything about it because it's not politically expedient, that's unacceptable to me. So it will take a bipartisan coalition, but it's going to take people standing up and saying, we want to put this history, we want to put the practices and the legislation of Strom Thurmond behind us. That's what it will take to repeal this legislation.
I think in politics we hear a lot the phrases people over politics or policy over politics. And it's really a catchphrase is what it is. It's something that feel like they throw on their campaigns, looks great in the hashtag. This is kind of what rubber meets the road if you're putting people and good policy ahead of political practices. Yusuf, thank you again for sharing about this amendment. To your point, probably a lot of people have not heard of it, so we thank you for shedding light on it and for talking about where we think this might go in the future. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Watch Lighthouse TV wherever you go. Available on Roku, Amazon Fire TV, and Apple TV. You can view our in-house studio productions on demand or watch what's on the station right now with our 24/7 live stream. Search Lighthouse TV online on your streaming device or go to our website for more information. Visit lighthousetv.org to stay connected. There you can find out what's currently on the air and coming up, how to watch in your area on cable, satellite, broadcast, or streaming devices. Watch past programs or our live stream. Follow us on social media and learn more about the station, our hosts, and our programming. Lighthouse TV, positively different.
Welcome back to Face the Issues. Yusuf, first, thank you again for being with us. You, over these last 2 weeks, these 2 shows that we've been sitting here talking with you, you've shared a lot about your story and how it's impacted your work at the Century Promise, how it has kind of run in this collision course with the Thurmond Amendment, and now your work to repeal the Thurmond Amendment. You're a young guy. Your story isn't even half written yet. And when you look forward with all these things that you're working on, accomplishing, raising a daughter, when you look forward to the rest of your story, where do you see it going?
Well, I want to continue to have a positive impact on people. I want to continue to extend opportunity to people. I want folks to have the same opportunities and benefits that I've enjoyed in this country. And so you've mentioned a couple of things. I'm also involved with the Real Estate Lab, where we created a program to help underrepresented youth get started in real estate. So that's really the vision, Sam, is to continue to have an impact and continue to make this world better than where I found it.
Yeah. Toward that end, the Thurmond Amendment, this is a big part of that work. You have an organization, and so to speak on this, what's the website and how can people find out more about this?
Yep, people can visit the website thurmondamendment.org. Okay. And on that website, you'll be able to read my Washington Post piece. You'll be able to watch a documentary I'm featured in. You'll be able to learn a lot about this legislation and its impact on this country.
Yeah. Thurmondamendment.org. And I think that's just so important. We tend to think and care about the issues that directly impact us. And so when something does not directly affect us, we kind of think out of sight, out of mind. But yet, these are, one of the things I live my life by is the idea of love your neighbors as yourself. And these are laws that impact our neighbors, not just here, but all over the country.
Well, it impacts all of us. If people can't make the most of their second chance, Sam, it costs all of us.
It does. It absolutely does. They say it takes a village. Yusuf, you've been doing so much work and leading that, and we deeply appreciate you and the work that you do.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. That is our show for today. I want to thank, again, Yusuf Dahl for joining us and for his work on repealing the Thurmond Amendment. Again, you can find out more at the website thurmondamendment.org. We want to thank each of you for joining us as well. We hope to see you again right back here next week. My name is Sam Chen. On behalf of all of us here at Face the Issues, thank you and good night.